Good morning, everyone, and it's good to see you here today. Well, last week we started talking about the Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra is a difficult text, but we'll move along and explore it and try to understand some of its features, and hopefully some of it will soak into our bones. The Vajra Chetaka Prajnaparamita Sutra is the full name, the Diamond Cutting Perfect Wisdom Sutra. As with many of the Mahayana sutras, we don't really know its provenance. Some say it's the final teachings of the Buddha when he was older, in the decade or so before his death, that were passed along by oral transmission until they were finally transcribed into Sanskrit several centuries later. Others say that sometime, perhaps in the 3rd century CE, it was composed by one or more authors, Buddhist monks in northern India. But whatever its origin, it has been profoundly studied by Buddhists in the Mahayana tradition all throughout Asia for centuries. The sutra was, I think it's well agreed, originally written in Sanskrit, and then Kumarajiva translated it into Chinese. So there are many translations in English from either the Chinese or from the Sanskrit, and they're all fairly similar. There are some minor differences among them. The Diamond Sutra is difficult to understand, and you might even say it's not intended to be understood. It's intended to challenge assumptions, to, as translator Mu Song says, to transform perceptions. I think it's important to remember in all Dharma talks and all Buddhist studies of whatever type that the Buddha's project was the relief of human suffering. That's his primary concern. So the Diamond Sutra emphasizes the fact that, as the Buddha did, that human suffering is highly dependent upon the way we perceive things, the way we look at things, whether it, as you might say, is right view or not. Skillful view, a view that is more likely to relieve suffering and lead to freedom. So our perceptions can play profound tricks on us. And one way to illustrate this, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of this, is with optical illusions. Optical illusions can be of various types. You can have a figure ground illusion, as is seen here. Are we looking at a young woman's image, or are we looking at a saxophonist with a large nose? And actually, we're looking at neither. We're looking at an image. We're looking at dark marks on a white or off-white background, and we're perceiving different things. There are at least two different perceptions here. There may be more. Other kinds of optical illusions are of impossible figures. At first, when we look at this, it looks like, well, it's a cube. But wait a minute, is the top of the cube to the left, or is it to the right? Is it upside down? What is going on with this cube? And looking at it more, you realize it seems to be an impossible figure. You just don't know what it is. So your first impression is faulty. And ultimately, the structure of the cube, or the structure of whatever it is incomprehensible. So last time we introduced the Diamond Sutra and got up to a the first paradox. And we discussed that a little bit, and with the intention of discussing it a bit more before moving on. So I'll just, because it's so essential, this first paradox really encapsulates the whole sutra. So we'll start with it again. And it goes like this. The Buddha is talking to Subhuti about really how to, live out the life of a bodhisattva, and to settle the mind, and to keep thoughts under control. And the Buddha says all the bodhisattva mahasattvas who undertake the practice of meditation should cherish one thought only: when I attain perfect wisdom, I will liberate all sentient beings in every realm of the universe, whether they are egg-born, womb-born, moisture-born, or miraculously born. Those with form, those without form, those with perception, those without perception, and those with neither perception nor non-perception. So long as any form of being is conceived, I will allow it to pass into the eternal peace of nirvana, into that realm of nirvana that leaves nothing behind, and to attain final awakening. But the Buddha goes on, and yet, although immeasurable, innumerable, and unlimited beings have been liberated, truly no being has been liberated. Why? Because no bodhisattva who is a true bodhisattva entertains such concepts as a self, a person, a being, or a living soul. Thus, there are no sentient beings to be liberated, and no self to attain perfect wisdom. So I think pretty clearly we're dealing with different perceptions here. And one way of talking about it, which is common, is to say, well, there's the sort of the relative aspect of reality, the dualistic space where we tend to divide things into parts and talk about their interaction in that way, where there's a self, there's another, there's one being saving another being, that sort of thing. And then there's the ultimate reality. It's another way of talking about it, where there really isn't all this division into parts, that it's all one big interacting universe, interconnected. What Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. So you don't have one part influencing another part. You just have a constant flow of motion, of energy. And that can be compared to these optical illusions where you might see the young woman or you might see the saxophone. I think the Buddha here is encouraging us to be aware of these different ways of perceiving things, and to not get stuck in either one or the other. But to be aware of the illusory nature of both. Now, it is clear that some perceptions are more skillful than others. So it's not completely arbitrary. And the Buddha advocated through his various teachings a way of perceiving things, a way of acting in the world, because the perceptions precede action. Action doesn't occur just all at once out of nothing. It is preceded by a thought, or at least a way of perceiving the situation. And then there is action of body, speech, or mind that follows. And some actions, some speech, some thoughts are more likely to lead to happiness, to peace, than others. So it's not arbitrary. But the Buddha advocated getting beyond the usual dualistic way of perceiving the world. And the remainder of the Diamond Sutra really explores the implications of this. And the first exploration of implication has to do with generosity. Generosity is the first of the six so-called paramitas, the virtues that a bodhisattva strives to express. And the rest of the paramitas are not really mentioned explicitly in this text, but it's assumed that those reading the texts, being monks, Buddhist monks, were the initial audience for the text, would be aware of all six. So the first, generosity, is used as an example. There's a relatively short section about generosity that, again, I'll read, and I'm using Mu Song's translation from the Sanskrit here as a text for reading. Furthermore, Subhuti, in the practice of generosity, A bodhisattva should be unsupported. He or she should practice generosity without regard to sight, sound, touch, flavor, smell, or any thought that arises in it. Subhuti, thus, should a bodhisattva practice generosity without being supported by any notion of a sign. Why? When a bodhisattva practices generosity without being supported by any notion of a sign, his or her merit will be beyond conception. Beyond conception. So the language here is not the kind of language we customarily use, but other ways of expressing this are that when generosity occurs, there should be no giver, no recipient, and no gift. It's to distinguish generosity from a transaction. Huineng, the 8th century Zen teacher who was enamored with the Diamond Sutra, has this commentary about this section. When ordinary people practice charity, they only think about how they look and their own happiness. But when their reward ends, they descend into the lower realms of existence. Through his great kindness, the Buddha teaches us to practice charity free of appearances and not to think about how we look or about our own happiness, but to break through our miserly hearts within and to benefit all beings without. Through his great kindness, the Buddha teaches us to practice charity free of appearances and not to think about how we look or our own happiness, but to break through our miserly hearts within and to benefit all beings without. This is a challenge, I think. I think it's a challenge to because we live in such a transactional culture that there's a tendency to think of a gift as a transaction, that you do something for somebody and then that puts them into some kind of debt, and then they are required to do something for you in return. This certainly happens with holiday cards. Oh my, we got a holiday card from so-and-so. We need to send them one. A transactional view of generosity. And this is discouraged because it leads to sort of tension and anxiety in the mind. It's not a peaceful way to be in the world, in a constant marketplace of transactions. One other thing I'll mention is that, and this would have been common knowledge to the audience of this sutra at the time, because there there's sort of a established threefold nature of gifts, three kinds of gifts that the Buddha talks about in various places and appear in also the Mahayana sutras. First of all, there are material gifts, things that are necessary or desirable for our sustenance and well-being, food, shelter, other creature comforts, material gifts. And then there is the gift of what is sometimes called no fear and other times called friendliness. The gift of no fear being to present yourself to someone in such a manner that you do not arouse fear. In other words, that you are safe to be around, that you are, in short, friendly. Because fear is one of the most fundamental forms of suffering that we experience. So not arousing fear is a gift. And then there's the gift of Dharma. Now, the gift of Dharma can be something literal, like, just teaching what the Buddha taught. But the more effective gift of Dharma is to express the Dharma in your body and speech, to express the Dharma in your life, to live the Dharma. And this is the gift of Dharma to others. So I think we'll stop there with the thought or the question, how do we do this? How do we express generosity? How do we give without a giver and a recipient and a gift? Is this possible? And another question, and I think this is an important one, perhaps, and maybe a bit too conceptual, theoretical. But when you look at the paradox that we discussed, and there's the usual way of looking at things where there's someone saving another being or other beings. And the other way of looking at things where there are no beings and there's no one to be saved and there's no wisdom to be attained. Is that, in fact, the truth? Or is that just another perception? And that, in fact, does reality lie somewhere beyond both ways of perceiving things in a way that we cannot fully grasp, cannot fully communicate with words and thoughts and notions, cannot fully comprehend, but can live, can express in our lives. Prajna paramita. So we'll stop there, go into smaller groups for discussion, and return in a few moments. Thank you very much for listening today.